I am Ben Magnuson. I have been at One North for 12 years this month. Jessica and I were actually hired a couple weeks apart, and I had a real life comes at you fast moment on Sunday when I was taking a walk when I realized that we were now the most senior One North speakers at this event, if you just don't include householder as a person, which I had to make that anecdote work. But when I started my career, I came from a startup, and that experience sent me on a trajectory where I was very confident that some of the new philosophies of the new tech regime, the FANG companies espoused of moving fast and breaking things, having a data-driven approach to decision-making rather than a very stodgy hierarchical approach that I assumed was what companies like my father worked for. But life comes in waves for us all, so it was a very interesting moment to read an article that came out from Paul Graham. He is a founder of Y Combinator and wrote the post called Founder Mode, where he's actually criticizing this concept that is used by many. Warren Buffett talks about it a lot, of hiring great people and getting out of the way as an approach to scaling these companies as they go from small to large. And it tells an anecdote from a founder meetup from Brian Chesky, the Airbnb CEO, who talked about when he needed to grow his team from being a small startup to large at scale. Everyone was giving him the advice to hire great people, remove yourself from the equation, but the results were disastrous. And the room agreed. And this leads to this great paragraph from Paul Graham. Usually when everyone around you disagrees with you, your default assumption should be that you're mistaken. But this is one of the rare exceptions. VCs who haven't been founders themselves don't know how founders should run companies, and C-level execs as a class include some of the most skillful liars in the world. I like the spicy take. I think it's funny that he's basically one of the only people that could make that criticism, and we're like, ooh, that's a little mean, because he's punching down in one of the few in that position. When he gets to the point of providing solutions to it, I found it a little underwhelming. He basically proposes skip-level meetings, which I was surprised was not already part of their toolkit. Even Ryan Scholes will kneel down every once in a while and speak to me. And then the classic, be Steve Jobs, be a little bit more hands-on. That said, I'm poking a little bit of fun, but it's a fascinating article that makes you think about how can we grow and not just become what we are trying to change. And so part of this conversation included a response from Dan Davies, an economist and writer of the book, The Unaccountability Machine, who was dealing with the same sort of thoughts. Why are these large organizations so incomprehensible in their decision-making sometimes? But what he proposed instead of this founder mode concept that Paul Graham was talking about was, as he sought those questions out, he found inspiration from cybernetics. So cybernetics is the study of control systems as it applies to machines and living organisms. So don't need to say more, that's clear as day. It was a movement that came out of World War II where, as we saw, this was one of the first times where people really got to use computers throughout their use in the army. And they came to it fascinated by the power that it included, but these algorithms needed to be very strict and tell them exactly what to do. So they wanted to identify ways to make it more adaptive at learning. This is where we have the Alan Turing, can machines think? And so where they looked to, this was a cross-disciplinary group, is they looked to biology, to where they could find systems that were adaptable, like humans, like animals, who could have changes in their environment, soak them in, and change for the better. One of those cyberneticians was not focused on the computer aspect, though. He decided to apply it to organizations, which he described as artificial intelligence, and that the mixture of humans and technology in it made it something that did not feel quite like interacting directly with a person. So we're going to go through some of those ideas. His name is Stafford Beer. We'll talk through his viable systems model. We'll go through designing feedback, but it's completely non-visual, so get excited. And then we'll come back to this question to be like, how could we learn from cybernetics to apply that same problems that they were facing? So what he was trying to do, you have to remember this is written in the 60s and 70s, and large companies like this were, in the grand scheme of things, a very new phenomenon, and they were already dealing with massive technical change in the advent of personal computers being added to the model. So he wanted a model to understand like what were the components of successful large companies at that time. And so he has this set of 5 interrelated, interlocking subsystems, which we'll go through pretty quick, just get the concepts of it. So the first one, lowest level, system 1, you'll have a company that produces something. Where the production happens is at the lowest level. And then you'll need a system that regulates those activities so that they're not interfering with one another. Before you get to system 3, which is your middle management type structure. Looks across all your system 1s and looks for opportunities for efficiency and to optimize output. These systems 1, 2, and 3 can largely operate without much guidance from above. They're there to produce, and they look to produce as efficiently as possible. But what makes a company viable in that it can endure and stay and survive is the addition of something like system 4. This is no longer looking inward, it's looking outward into the environment and looking for changes in consumer behavior, opportunities from their competitors, and integrating that into the data that it's getting from below before we get to system 5. This is what Stafford Beer called the brain of the firm in his probably most famous work. And this is sort of a fluid concept. System 5 would obviously be more of your higher level functions within an organization. And he says its job is to set the identity. So what does that mean? That means both I'm determining what kind of company we are, but crucially it has to make the decision for what kind of company do we need to become based off of the information that I'm getting. So what did he use for this model? He used the human body system, right? I talked about how large organizations don't feel like interfacing with a human, but we have to take into account the whole system. It would be like talking to the automatic nervous system within our body. And when he looked at it, the ability for humans to adapt to their environment was the ideal for when looking at a well-functioning company. And there's 2 aspects of it that he found to be particularly powerful, which we'll talk about today. One is recursion, and 2 is keeping things in sync via feedback. So I'm going to talk about recursion. It's a great joke. So what is this concept? Well, all right, we just went through each of those systems, and obviously you could probably map each of those to certain roles within your company. But what makes it powerful is each of those subsystems should be present at every level of the company. So, quick example, I'm the director of data strategy. Within broader One North, I would probably be a system 1 because I work directly with clients and are probably an internal manager with my team. But within the data strategy team, I would be a system 5. I'm setting a lot of the direction and identity for our team. And there wouldn't be a specific role for every person, but they're shared across the team. And because each of those elements are shared within my team, we can push more autonomy as low in the organization as possible so that we're not constantly bothering Ryan with, what should I do? Is this good? Is this good? Right? That's the power of large organizations. They can push autonomy down and create scale and deal with issues that they've never come across before. But you could see the issue here. How do we create a bunch of as independent and autonomous systems as possible without it becoming a completely incomprehensible company? And so this is where the body is extremely good at creating feedback loops. So where things can go wrong is you have a bunch of teams within the organization that are trying to affect change but are completely blind to what the effects actually are. They're either operating and doing nothing but trying as hard as they can, or they're making a lot of change but completely blind to what's happening. And so we're going to talk about how we can identify where things are going wrong, but how you can try to provide information to them to change their decision making and help give them more autonomy to optimize it. So I like to think about the dashboard. Now, if you've seen any presentation on data visualization, this is usually like the first thing that comes up. It's the epitome of wonderful data design because it's minimalist. It's only giving you what you need to know. I've often been skeptical of that take. I do not know much about cars, though I drive them. I've only had an automatic transmission, so I couldn't tell you what RPM does or what it is. I know what it is. And I don't know what temperature my oil should be, but what makes the dashboard such a wonderful example of data design is that when I impress change on the car, I am immediately met with the measurement of what I've performed. That would be the ideal in so many aspects of our life, to where I make a decision and I get to know the results right away. I can't operate my car if you tell me my speed 10 miles ago, or what my average speed has been for the last month. But if you give it to me in the right time, I can adjust my speed and help. And by giving me the RPM and the oil, I know that I'm operating the car within safe bounds, which I always am because I'm an above average driver. So Dan Davies writes, for a piece of data to have the capacity to affect decisions, it has to arrive in time and in the right form. This comes from his evaluation of Stafford Beer. And I love these two concepts. We're going to go through how to do both of them. So designing feedback in the right form. One of the reasons why I wanted to go through that fairly thick exercise of each of the viable systems is Stafford Beer has this concept that each of these systems has a purpose, which we talked about, regulation, output, but they also have their own language. The language is tied to that purpose, right? The things that they're paying attention to are the things that let them know how good a job they're doing or what they need to adjust. And the problem is, when you are outside that system and trying to provide information, telling them what to change, you need to align it to that, which is difficult, but the way I like to think about it is not in, I'm speaking English and they're speaking French, or we're speaking different jargon. Think about your own body. When my stomach is growling in the middle of a meeting, I can't scream down like, you're embarrassing me, right? It's a completely different language and different sensation, so I have to align it to the purpose of it. And luckily, Stafford Beer gives us his most famous phrase, if you've run into it, the purpose of a system is what it does. So in order to speak in the same language of this system, we have to identify what its purpose is. And luckily, rather than needing to start from the top, figure out what all the different sources of data are, look through its documentation, he says, all that we need to do is look at what they output. Whatever they're doing the most of, that's their purpose. So understand what that is, and then you will have to show how what you're providing is either affecting that. And the best way to do that, the way that our body operates, is it will give positive feedback, pleasure, or negative feedback, pain, so that it can get it to constantly adjust and find a new homeostasis. The sad part about this is there is a chance that the data that you provide has no impact on their purpose. And this is where we probably get that situation where people are always talking about, there's a lot of data, I need you to give me insights. And what we should hear is you didn't give me data that aligned to my purpose, and so you need to find out how that connects in order for me to change it. And I think that's fair. I think the burden should be on you to achieve that aspect of the design. Identify what they're doing and align it to their language to show, here's what is impacting sales negatively down the line. You're selling terrible deals that are costing us a lot of money down the road, but you still keep doing it. Well, you have to align it to that language or find some way to change the incentives. Some of the most common mistakes that I think of is the assumption that if we give a team some high-level KPIs, just because they're well known and people generally understand them, that it will have an impact. Because farther down that you go in the company, there's probably only going to be a marginal portion that they relate to, but the bigger danger is that there's a severe lag between where their impact will be felt. So you're putting in front of them all these high-level KPIs, but you're not showing them what the actual feedback is as they're making the day-to-day changes instead of more high-level policy. And then the other aspect of it is if you're not actually aligning it to what they're doing in a way that shows what's good and bad, it's just noise. If you want it to be something that they can actually make changes to what they're impressing change on, you need to at least allude to pleasure or pain feedback. Sometimes we do have a situation where it's not actually clear on a day-to-day basis how it will affect my output. For instance, I'll just come out with it. It's a safe space. I'm terrible at time entry. It is how my company gets paid. Doesn't really change my day-to-day behavior, but when they send me emails saying you're literally the worst at it, have some self-respect, I feel sad and I try to change it. The last is that showing that you are making no change is only bad if it's unrelated to the action that they're doing, right? The RPM example. If I'm making a bunch of changes to the car and the RPM looks fine, that's good information. If RPMs are completely unrelated to digging a ditch, obviously that's bad information. It's not going to be something that's helpful. So don't assume just because there has been no change that it's something you need to relate. Operating within safe bounds is a good part of how your body shows homeostasis. One of my favorite examples here actually comes from my own team. So Angela on my team formerly worked at an energy trading firm, and every day their commodity traders got this big list of pricing, the changes that had happened, and they would use their savvy of the industry to make purchasing decisions. Her team was in charge of trying to optimize those. And so they looked at different forecasting models and found, hey, based off of where the price is, here are some commodities you should definitely look at trading in. The way that many analysts would do this is just they would make a dashboard and they say, you should go look at this on your own time, because that's easier for them. What they did is every day for their pricing sheet, next to that commodity, if it was something that they thought was a good idea, they put a little light bulb next to it that says, hey, this is a good idea to trade for, and it was wildly popular. They kept it in the way that they work and in time, and it made it helped. So designing for in time. This one is tricky because I feel like we should be in a good spot with this in that it's easier than ever to deliver real-time analytics. The problem is, who are those relevant for? So for higher level systems, when you're trying to send information up the chain to management, it's easier to want to show day-to-day changes and all the work that you're doing, but the sensitivity is too high. It's harder for them to follow those changes because their policies are meant to be enacted over months. But for lower level systems, we have the KPI problem. They're not seeing any change to it based off of their minute by minute or day-to-day decisions, and so there's a lag. A great example from Stafford Beer and how that he thought about this came from probably the pinnacle of his career, where he was asked by the president of Chile, Salvador Allende, who was a socialist president who took to power and was going to nationalize a number of industries, which they knew from the USSR had some severe difficulties when it came to shortages and making it all work. But he wanted to take the concepts of cybernetics. Stafford Beer came in wide-eyed that so many different variables to try and manage at one time and be deliberate, but what we could do is be as fast as possible. So due to capital controls, they could really only use what they had, which were telex machines that he hooked up, that's a telex machine, hooked up to every single factory in the company that were just sending data with how much they produced and how many people attended, so that in a central location room, which was extremely cool looking for some reason, it went to the central committee in charge of pricing schemes, and they were just looking at two things to keep it simple. What did they produce, and what were they capable of producing that day to understand shortages? But what they sent down to the factories to keep them as autonomous as possible was not the history of what they've produced over the last month, but they kept them focused on the next day to keep it as relevant as possible. They only said, here's what we need you to produce tomorrow, and let us know as soon as possible if you don't have enough people to do it. This concept allowed them to get through a pretty difficult trucker shortage where every single transportation company refused to move anything. However, if you're a history major, you may know that it didn't have a long life because Salvador Allende was assassinated by Pinochet right after that. But we're going to move to solving for founder mode. So, I'm a little off time, but I'm just going to go. So hire great people and get out of the way. What is going wrong here? So what Stafford Beer talks about here, the number one place that companies get stuck is with system 4. I think you probably could map, again, some of these different systems to roles. System 4, this intelligence function, tends to get distributed very widely across the company. But in your body, if you remember that brain image that came from Zach and Kathy's talk, has a lower level brain function that's in charge of two things. One, connecting our ability to see, but two, sending that information up and down the spinal cord to the brain. So what are we talking about here? In this vertical orientation, too much of the signals that need to get up to the brain to give it feedback on what its strategies are doing often get left out. So if you think about the Lego example, the orientation for these intelligence systems were too focused externally. They're trying to meet all the different changes to consumer behavior and demand and putting all this operational complexity down, but there was no signal going back up. So that's where you end up with a Paul Graham saying they're liars because they're not getting the information they need. And I'm of the opinion they're not liars, and they're great, and they should keep me employed. So there's some things here that are real. Get out of the way is partially right. If you stay too hands-on, you're losing the power of recursion to keep your employees as autonomous as possible so that they can respond to variable or changes into the environment. But two, the brain needs feedback too. So keep solving so many of the problems as they go up the pipe, or pieces of the problems, means that you're not sending some of the real signals that the brain needs to know what are my policies causing. Now, I made fun of skip level meetings, but I think they're a great idea. But one of the things that I saw in the research for this came from Patrick Hoverstadt, who wrote about cybernetic principles in companies in the fractal organization, that instead of skip level monitoring, skip level meetings, performing skip level monitoring, where you go as close to the production lines as possible, unannounced, and just observe, right? You have the opportunity for people to align what they're saying to you to try and seem as good as possible, but you're not there to necessarily punish. You're there to understand we're making a bunch of changes at the top. What are you seeing from the customers, and how is it affecting our operations? And that's internal, but I really love this example from Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe. It says that every other week we have a customer join for the first 30 minutes of our management team meeting. They share their candid feedback, and 40 leaders from across Stripe listen. Even though we already have enough customer feedback mechanisms, they have NPS, they have surveys, this time to actually engage with the customer gives the extra feedback needed to this management team to understand where are we succeeding and where do we still have an opportunity to grow. So where it gets wrong is, again, the huge power and potential of our companies is to release our technology and people with as much autonomy as possible. We talked a lot about people, but the same goes for anyone that has worked with an LLM like me. For this research, I made a Stafford Beer bot where I read both of his books. They're quite long, and he evolves his thinking through them, so I had to keep it straight. I did not want hallucinations, so I put very distinct directions to it and made a RAG search, and every single response was, there's not enough context for me to answer. So I thought it was very stupid. But then I just engaged with the broader LLM that I was using, and it answered all my questions. So I was the one that was stupid, actually. The same concepts are here, right? The bad tendency of micromanagement isn't necessarily that you're jumping in, but you're going to create a culture of people constantly saying, is this right? And just completely neutering their ability to handle a customer one-on-one or a change one-on-one. So one of the examples, I think, for the power of just letting people go and trusting in some of the environmental features that will help keep things in track comes from Stafford Beer's protege. Can anyone guess who he is based off what you know? Why, it's Brian Eno, David Bowie's producer on his two most famous albums. His mother-in-law lent him a copy of Brain of the Firm, and he was fascinated by it and wrote an article about using cybernetic principles in music. And in that article, he brings up this avant-garde piece of music where this is the entirety of it, right? There's no musical notes. It just asks people to... So in the directions, you're not supposed to use trained musicians. They come, they choose their own note to start. They're reading this paragraph that comes from a book from Confucius. But it does have some things that prevent chaos. Do not sing the note on 2 consecutive lines, but they do move forward at their own pace. Anyone that's probably familiar with chaos theory might think this is going to be radically different every time with some of these choices. But what Brian Eno found fascinating from this is that he performed it 6 times, and it tended to create the same drone note in every single performance. So with very few directions, he was able to create consistency from the composer. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, that sounds fascinating. What are some of the reasons for this? Sorry, I jumped ahead. I was going to say something else. Why does this happen, where something with very few notes ends up being the same? Brian Eno writes that basically because they're near each other, hearing each other, it's very hard not to just try to harmonize with the person next to you and be completely discordant. Unfortunately, this piece is very slow, so it's hard to even show you where it hits to the drone note. But I'm bringing you something that is still avant-garde. This comes from Butch Morris, who is a composer that purely composes through improv. He just gives visual signals and uses his orchestra to take them and make something and trust them to use their autonomy in their own instruments. It is still relatively caustic, though, but I love the messages around it, so we're going to go through it.
One bit of information. That all came from one bit of information. All sonic information is information for construction. All sonic information. We do anything. We take this. If I say, do that. With me. Okay, the idea is this. Whether they can literally make this sound or not, in their creative mind, they can go in the direction of that sound, and that's good enough for me. They can find it. He used the back of his bow. She was bowing above her bridge. She was doing double stops over here. Do you understand what I mean? That sounds close enough for me. And from there, you can construct. We could take that for 20 minutes, easy.
Do we want to hear it for 20 minutes? I'm just kidding. I love the concept, though. We're dealing with what we inevitably perceive, based off of some of the anxiety in the room, to be some massive changes in the environment around us that we don't necessarily know how we're going to do. And in a large company, it can be really hard to align everyone at once. But what he says there is he merely sends them in a direction and gives them the trust to operate. But they're all in a room together where they're getting the feedback of what each other are doing and can, in that moment, sync up to create something harmonious. And in his actual orchestras, it is quite beautiful sometimes. It's much more like jazz. So that's the opportunity for us. Where we start to sound discordant, we need to identify the area where they are no longer receiving the feedback that we have, and in order to help them change, create information that's actually going to speak in their language. Thank you.